that we really have to think about the circular economy and ushering it in a way that is inclusive and equitable for all. So I want each of you right now to think about not only what are you going to be doing. A few breakout sessions ago, we turned to our partner and said, what is the action we're going to take coming out of here, right? I want you to do one more step in that, in case you've already kind of put your pads down and you stopped thinking about it. Think about what you're going to commit to in terms of making our circular economy inclusive and equitable for all. So this is not just a circular economy for some that can afford it, for some who have access, for the privileged who are working in it, but it's accessible and equitable for all. So as part of our panel, I would like to bring out the folks that we're going to have a discussion with. We've got Valerie from National Geographic, who we've heard a few times before. So thank you so much, Valerie, for coming out here. Valerie Craig. And Tawanna Black. So Tawanna is here as well, and we're going to be just sharing some of our stories, yes, about the work that we are all doing in terms of making our circular economy more inclusive. So if we think about the current linear systems that we have, they have disproportionately affected women, minorities, people with less income, people with less education, and other types of people. And so when we think about this, we should really be thinking about how are we, each and every one of us, individually as well as organizations, trying to change that and actually making progress towards it. If we think about this room, and this is very specifically called power and privilege, because each of us, regardless of how much power and privilege, each of us in this room has an amount of power and privilege that we need to own, right? Each of us is here. By the very nature of us sitting in this chair, in these chairs this morning, we have some of that. And so we should be owning it and really thinking about what we are doing to help change the equation on that so that more people have access. So Valerie, you have done amazing things with not just you, but you as well, but amazing things from a National Geographic perspective to really think about the role of power and privilege and how you can shift the balance.
Yeah, you know, I love the work I do. I think I'm extremely lucky with the organization that I'm part of, but I had a particularly proud moment last year when we published the race issue. The part of that I'm most proud of is the upfront, the letter from the editor, right, where we owned our past. And we took a moment to really reflect on a really rocky history in this space where I think we owned our position of power and privilege without considering any of the repercussions. And it's really completely changed the way we work. And I think what's become really important for us is both thinking on the internal and the external. So on the internal, if we're developing a project, who's at the table, right? If we're going to be doing a huge project across a wide range of stakeholders, and whether that's in another country or it's representing different parts of the supply chain or different parts of the economy, we need to make sure that all of those people are at the table at the development stage, but then also what is the work we're doing? And if we implement a solution, who does that impact in what way? And I think, you know, I'm here talking a lot about plastics, and we're at a moment where we're thinking about what are all the solutions we can put into place, in particular in developing countries where mismanaged waste is a huge problem. If you put in a giant facility in a place where it's the informal economy that's doing all the work currently, what happens to those thousands of workers, right? So it's a position we have to consider, and it's, you know, we're working in India right now on a big expedition, and we have a cross-cultural team of women, which is very interesting for a team of women to succeed in India, and it's going really well. It's super challenging, but also then making sure that as we're moving through our expedition, we're connecting with communities all along the way to hear from them. What's happening? How do you manage waste in your community? What does it look like for you? So that when we start to propose solutions, it's relevant and helpful and beneficial, and also is what people are asking for.
That makes sense. Yeah, we're doing that in some of our work regarding waste in Surabaya, Indonesia, looking at, we've done estimates, and there's estimates out that there's over 800 women who voluntarily are picking up waste and collecting waste. And so on one hand, we want to make sure that system in itself is not just, because the women are not getting paid for any of that.
Right.
But we're also trying to understand what are the implications of any sort of solutions that come up. So in any gatherings that we have, in any workshops, and any solutions being developed, we make sure that everyone is at the table to have those different types of conversations.
And how do you bring them in?
How do you bring them in? We work in local economies everywhere, right? I think that's it. Going out and having conversations with people and inviting them in. I think so much of what it is having a very comfortable, having a comfortable place for people to engage, right? Coming in with humility. We don't know. Obviously, we all have levels of expertise in certain things, but we don't know what is actually happening on the ground. And so coming in with a level of humility, being very intentional about the way that we approach things, and also being very intentional about our signaling, I think. In so much of what we do, we think about it and intentionally invite people in and include them, and be very intentional about how we signal who's welcome and who has access to even the programs that we do. Because we recognize, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's overseas, that we are privileged in the sense that people are counting us and funding us to come in and build out these really inclusive ecosystems. And so if we're not doing our job in being more inclusive, then we're just repeating really what's happened in the past.
Yeah, constantly recurring the same.
Constantly and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so the work that we're doing right now is we're kicking off a lot of the work in Southeast Asia focused on plastic prevention. We have a significant focus on both women, so looking at it from a gender lens perspective, but also the informal sectors. But Tawanna, I would love to hear what you're doing here in Minneapolis, actually, to focus on an inclusive economy.
Absolutely. So here in Minneapolis, I lead the Center for Economic Inclusion, which is an organization that's been designed to be able to address work and challenges that many regions across the country face, where we see that people of color really have been locked out of the economy and have not been able to thrive at the rate that many other people have been able to thrive. And we're a region that is prosperous. Hopefully you've been able to enjoy this region in your time here, those of you who aren't from the Twin Cities. And yet we find that people of color are not benefiting from the prosperity in our region. And so our work is about how we equip private sector organizations and public sector organizations to identify policies, practices, and behaviors that lead to exclusion, and then replace those with policies and practices and behaviors that are more inclusive. And when I think about this work of building a circular economy, building an economy that benefits us all, it requires helping us all think about how we take those values of circularity and marry those with values of inclusion in ways that ultimately lead to outcomes. And to the point that you all have raised here, having voice is important. Having power is more important. Being welcome at the table is important. Getting invited to the party is important. What you do once you get invited to that party is even more important. And so our work comes into play in helping organizations and companies think about what are those solutions that come into play, whether those are things like your supply chain. What businesses that are owned by people of color are in that supply chain who can help you live out those values of circularity? How do you know that? How do you know what businesses that are owned by people of color are even up for grabs, right? What farmers that may be in communities of color can help you live out those values of circularity and inclusion at the same time? How you think about where your business is located if you're looking to expand, or you have businesses in your supply chain who are looking to expand. How do you encourage them to locate in disinvested communities and communities of color and live out those values of circularity at the same time, so that both of your values come into play and you grow the economy? Those are things that traditionally we haven't thought about. We've unfortunately thought about growing the economy and inclusion as opposite tracks, that we could do one at a time. When the economy is well, we can kind of solve for the needs of communities of color. When the economy is not doing well, we have to think of that as charity and come over here and take care of business. Now, research tells us that's not so true, and we can do those things at the same time, and our organization is really designed to support businesses in doing just that.
Yeah, that is such a great, yeah,
I just want to follow up. It must be uncomfortable, right? You're working with companies and you're trying to get them to really directly confront their own biases.
Absolutely.
How has that worked for you? What is the response you're getting to that?
You know, there are days when it is absolutely uncomfortable. I get that question a lot. And at the same time, we use a data-informed approach that's also very market responsive. And the data suggests that we're leaving money on the table. And ultimately, we're in this both because of the moral cause, but ultimately self-interest is what rules the day. And it shows in our market, we're leaving about $30 billion on the table every day that we have wage inequity between people of color and whites. That's self-interest, that it helps every business, it helps every person in our region to the extent that we can solve for that. And in the same ways that we've proven data around the values of circularity, that same data exists not only in every region and state across this country, but ultimately across the world.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to do a little quick pivot here. In case you have not noticed, we are all women sitting up here, very intentionally, I assume. And I think it's really important to think about it also in terms of race, in terms of people who are disadvantaged, but I think a lot about the circular economy in terms of being a woman and what the convenience has led in general women to benefit from, right? So much of the work of women has been improved because of the modern conveniences of plastics, of disposable diapers, of all these types of things that when we really think about changing that, what does that look like? And it doesn't matter if it's bottled water in India or if it's diapers here. And yes, I know it's fantastic to use all those things, but at the end of the day, we're talking about time, and time is money. And women are trying to get included in this. So do you have any thoughts of that? As a consumer, as an organization, do you have thoughts about how people can be thinking about access and impact for the products that they're making?
You know, a few people have referenced the Time Magazine or Life Magazine picture, which was this celebration of disposable living in the 50s. And part of that article talked really specifically about freeing the modern housewife from the burden of dishes, right? It really was looking at progress. And I think that's a really big deal when you're looking at that women still in this country are predominantly the caregivers and taking care of the house and working. These conveniences make that work possible and make it possible to have more and more women higher up in their organizations, right? And take on the more demanding jobs and still have families. So I do think it's a wildly important consideration, and to think about how can we find some of those alternative products like what Loop is trying to do, where you still have a huge convenience factor without generating additional waste.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Tawanna?
I think the opportunity to also speak to values, that ultimately those conveniences are also driven by values and the balance of those values. And so to the extent that we're able to speak to women at the heart and the mind at the same time and recognize that we're able to do both. And how do we drive that long-term value? How do you speak to me in terms of my long-term values and help me understand the trade-offs and the benefits? I think as the concepts were first introduced to me, that ability to check me on those long-term values and how do I make decisions today that pay off in those interests? And at the same time, how does business catch up? How does business start making decisions and speak to me in terms that speak to both my day-to-day needs, but also my long-term values? It helps me start to spend my resources differently.
Absolutely. So take note if you're really thinking about how do we change the narrative, right? How are we thinking about it through a lens of power and privilege as well and access? So we could talk forever up here, and we could talk for all of you, but I wanted to just give a chance to let a question come in. There's someone from the sidebar.
Yeah, absolutely. And this conversation, thank you for this conversation. It really seems to be resonating to make sure that we bring this conversation back to making sure it's an inclusive one. And we have one question specifically for Tawanna. The idea is, what's one ask that you would have for this group when it comes to catalyzing local economic development?
Absolutely. An ask that I would have for you is to open your eyes. Often we miss the things and the opportunities that are right in front of us because we tend to operate in silos. We tend to, I think I mentioned earlier, tend to operate and think about, okay, inclusivity is over here, race is here, gender is there, circularity values are there, business bottom line is even somewhere over here, and it tends to be the one that's right in front of us. And yet there are opportunities all around us to begin to solve at the intersections of economic development, of workforce development, and advancement of solving for our local communities at the same time that we solve for the global bottom line. And those assets that you have in your communities, those nonprofit organizations, your public sector partners, can go the distance. They can understand the objectives that you're discussing here this week of the circular economy. if you invite them to the table. I'm grateful to Target, who reached out to me several months ago and said, we're hosting and convening on the circular economy. Can you come and talk to us about how economic inclusion intersects? And I'll be honest, I didn't know a clue about the circular economy, and I'm gratefully married to an engineer and said, hey, educate me quickly so that I can go do this intersection. But thankfully, in the last few months since that event, I've been able to bring my team along and educate them, and it's helped us now start to bring our community partners along. And so I would encourage all of you, go the distance, look at those partners who are right in front of you, and look for the intersections that can help us all speed up the outcomes that we need, not only for our communities, but ultimately also for our economy.
I think education. I think never underestimate the opportunity to not only engage, but also to educate.
Absolutely.
Right? It's so critical. We've worked with so many different startup companies who are so focused on mission-driven, solving really big problems in the world, and we say, what about inclusion? And they're like, what?
Right.
And so whenever we just do some basic education, they start thinking differently.
Right.
And opening up their eyes and inviting more people and hiring differently. So never underestimate
Absolutely.
the power of education. So, all right. One more question?
Yes, we do have one more question. It was referenced early in the panel, the sort of role of emerging economies, right? So, and there's lots of different cultural implications around how they deal with circular and we deal with circular, very different philosophies. So is there anything in particular that you feel we could learn from examples there? I don't know how closely you're following, but any advice that we can learn from emerging economies and how we should be including them and how they should be including us?
So I'm sure you have a response to this too. I'm going to jump in on something a little bit different. So I think we talked a lot about rural economies, but Taiwan is a really, really, really interesting example where Taiwan now has one of the most incredible waste systems of anywhere I've seen in waste management, and it's now an incredibly clean place. Right, and part of this is that the city went and looked at how do we engage people, how are we going to get people to change behavior, and it got down to finding the right little jingle that the waste truck should be playing that would get everybody to come out and say, okay, it's trash time, right? And they do this super regularly, and there is no other means of disposal. There aren't any garbage cans on the street. You have to keep your waste. And then it gets picked up every few days from your home. It means it's a structure of the lifestyle, when our business hours, though I think solutions just have to be super context specific, but I would challenge that any American coming up with a solution would have come up with that solution in the absence of actually working with the community to understand what are those triggers, how do we get people participating, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well with that, you've got the one thing that we asked you to do, right? Really think about how you can contribute to the inclusive and equitable economic activities that we're doing from a circular perspective as you leave here. And thank you. It was great.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you so much.